Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about leadership and the importance of voice. Not the leader's voice, but the leader allowing other people to have a voice. And my guest today is Kevin Hancock, who is the CEO and president of Hancock Lumber, as well as the author of the book, The Seventh Power: One CEO's Journey into the Business of Shared Leadership. And on this episode, I talk not only to Kevin about his book, The Seventh Power, but also we talk about how a diagnosis for Kevin of spastic dysphonia actually prevented Kevin from using his own voice and relying on those in his organization to elevate their voices. And what he found in that experience was how important it was to have other people be able to share their voices for an organization really to succeed. So why don't we jump into that conversation? Kevin, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast today. As I mentioned before we started this, I really enjoyed so much reading your book, The Seventh Power. One of the quotes that you had in here that I pulled off, it said, "Our growth only ends when we call off the search." To me, this book seems as though it's an outline for that search, as well as a roadmap in terms of the 7 lessons that you've outlined here and some of the great stories. And I was hoping you could start out by giving the listeners an opportunity to hear, what was your motivation for writing this book?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me, Patrick. It's always a pleasure to be with you. So the motivation for writing the book, it's just become really clear to me that we need a new leadership model for the 21st century. The leadership model that dominates today really goes back thousands of years. It's that power to the center, command and control, the empire comes first approach. And while it might have worked 100, 200, or 1,000 years ago, it's not going to get us where we want to go in the 21st century. So we really need a new model that's about dispersing power, not collecting it, and making other voices strong. And I believe that, have been practicing that within my own company, but really felt something bigger was at play here. And so I set out on what turned out to be a series of adventures, as you pointed out, Patrick, that took me from the Navajo reservation in the Arizona desert all the way to Kiev in the Ukraine, looking for some clues about what this new leadership model might look like and might be about.
You're not just somebody that wrote a book. You're walking the talk. You come from experience in terms of this needing to relook the model that was being used, command and control.
Yeah, no, right. The backdrop, as you know, Patrick, about a decade ago, I acquired a rare voice disorder called spasmodic dysphonia that made speaking difficult. Now, I'm the CEO of a lumber company in Maine. We have 560 employees, and our mills do business all over the world. And quite quickly, I had to find a different approach to leading that didn't include a lot of talking. And essentially, that led me down this path of sharing leadership bit by bit until it became a really broad vision of, hey, everybody can lead. Every single person in this company leads us. And when power is dispersed and leadership's shared, an organization's performance could expand exponentially. That was the vision I had. I've spent the last 10 years trying to fulfill that within our own company, and our performance took off, including, most importantly to me, the employee experience as defined by the employees. We've been a best place to work in Maine now for 7 years in a row. So I had seen firsthand what was possible through my own work. And then I really felt, though, that this was bigger than just a lumber company in Maine and my own experience. And that's what pulled me out into the world to do a bit more research, which became the basis for the book, The Seventh Power.
One of the powers that you talk about is culture, which I think is what really you just spoke to, is you've created that culture. One of the other powers, though, that I think really resonated with me was around change and where it's created from within. And to me, that is something that I know we talked about this earlier, seems to be the piece, as I've seen it often, that's been missing in regards to impactful and durable leadership change, is that it does need to start internally. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think that is where it starts. And this really was my big epiphany or tipping point. When I was a younger manager and leader, I really thought that leadership was about paying attention to what other people were doing. And what ended up happening, however, with my own voice condition, which started to force change upon me, the pattern I started to see is the most powerful change I could create was from me changing. And so the entire orientation of leadership, to me, needs to be flipped. My primary job as a leader is to become the change, that iconic line from Gandhi, become the change I wish to see in the world, and to focus more on getting myself right and trusting that when I do that, that starts to create the cultural conditions for others to do the same. So the short idea there really is that leadership's actually an inside job. It's about working on ourselves and modeling and mentoring what it is we want to see.
There was a quote that I had used for many years that was attributed to John Quincy Adams, and it was, if your actions inspire someone to do more, dream more, learn more, and become more, you're a leader. And what I loved about that was there's nothing in there about a title. It's about your actions. Your actions inspire people to do those things. And it speaks to what you're saying. Now, in doing a lot more digging on that one quote, it come to find out that it's actually attributed to Dolly Parton. To me, I love even more, because if you think about it, when's the last time you heard something bad said about Dolly Parton, right? I mean, she always seems to be on the right. Her actions do inspire people.
Yes.
In so many different ways. So to me, it's even more fitting. But
so true.
But it speaks to exactly what you're saying. This idea of actions are what inspire us. And those really come from, I think, if I'm not comfortable with who I am internally, how can I ever be there for other people?
Right.
The way they need to be there.
Right. Exactly. The big push within our organization with our managers has been to encourage them to pay a bit more attention to themselves and a bit less attention to others. Now, when I say attention, I don't mean love, focus, and energy. We have to show up for everybody around us. But when you want to change something, all you really need to do is sit down, close your door, and look inward. and work on yourself. And that's a really empowering concept too. Think about it this way. In that older traditional model where someone else has to change for my world to get better, think about how limiting that idea is, how debilitating that idea is. The power I need is beyond my control. And the whole concept of this leadership model in my book is no, the power you need is sitting right inside you. It lives within you.
It's so true. I did a podcast episode very early on where I talked about the most important leadership tool that I thought you might be able to possess is a mirror.
Yes.
Look at yourself. Is really look at yourself.
No, there's a music passage in my book at the end of one chapter from one of Michael Jackson's songs, and that's the line I took. I'm looking at the man in the mirror, and I'm asking him to make a change. That's a brilliant line.
Yeah. We hear a lot about mindsets right now, growth or fixed. The fixed mindset is that belief that it's other people that are at fault here, and the growth really is about saying, how do I change things? What do I need to do first?
Right. Now, in fairness, to help people think about this in a different paradigm, I think the 24/7 connectivity of social media and television media has really made people feel overwhelmed and less in control. If you sat and watched the news all day, you would likely feel a loss of control. One of the things I really push, though, and I talk about in my book, is I think, generally speaking, the world in real life is more manageable than the world through a screen. And when you shut that screen down and focus on what's in front of you, the ability to control, impact, and influence what's in front of you is really greater than we might think. And actually, all we can do, if you build out what we're talking about, I've really concluded that change is a 3-step process. We change the world first within us, then beside us. As a result of the change we created within us, it impacts people beside us, which then impacts people beyond us, within, beside, beyond. But you've got to have the discipline and the fortitude and the insight to know where to do the work. And it can be scary to realize that, I've actually got to start with myself.
I will often attribute that back to, I think it's intentional vulnerability, where I have to put myself in that position of being vulnerable. If I want things to change, it requires me to do that. And to me, that's the greatest sense of courage or demonstration of it. When I make myself vulnerable, to me, it speaks of my greatest strength and not a weakness.
I agree. I love that. I try to talk openly about this within our company. I've never seen a weakness or a problem within our company that I could not trace back to me. And something I could have done or didn't do that could have helped influence a different outcome. For example, Patrick, we had a situation at one of our stores a couple years ago that I was really disappointed in how some things were handled. 5 or 6 of us came together as managers, and the way I ended up choosing to handle the meeting is I went in the room and just talked about the list of things I felt I had done or had not done to contribute to that poor outcome. Spontaneously, everybody in the room did the same. We made so much progress, and the only thing that happened in that room is everyone talked about what they could have controlled, meaning within them, what they could have done differently to have helped create a different outcome. So when you've gotten that vulnerability, it creates a whole different culture. The only finger pointing ever really turns inward in that example where I'm pointing at me.
When I hear you tell that story, it reminds me of the work done around psychological safety. There was an environment there where people felt as though, okay, this is okay to talk about deficiencies or what we didn't do well or my responsibility in this without feeling as though I'm going to be punished or retaliated against or ridiculed, whatever it might be. There's a safety component there that's created.
I totally agree. In fact, that makes me think about for me, the mission of all of this, the goal or the outcome. And I articulated it in the form of a question, Patrick. What if everybody on Earth felt trusted, respected, valued, heard, and safe? So I think there are about 7 billion people on Earth, and let's say, just pretend, all 7 billion of them today felt trusted, respected, valued, heard, and safe. What might change? I think everything might change. I think the root of all evil lies in the absence of people feeling trusted, respected, valued, heard, and safe, and not judged, really honored exactly as they are, which makes me think of one of the big lessons or chapters in the book, which is dedicated to this idea that listening is for understanding, not judgment.
Yeah.
There's so much talk about listening and the importance of it, but the critical question there is, why are we listening?
Yeah.
And the conclusion I've come to is we need to be listening simply to understand. And it's getting beyond right or wrong. It's just meeting people where they are at that moment and understanding where they're coming from. And when you give up judgment, the world gets so much lighter. It's just so much easier to interact with people when you stop trying to be the judge of what's happening.
Yeah. I love how you broke out each of those, because I will often think just in terms of valued and heard. When people don't sense those, I think you either run into experiences or situations where people disengage, they pull back, or they engage in ways that are unproductive to the group, the society, wherever they are. And I think we're living that right now. I truly believe that, where people don't feel valued and heard wherever they are, that some people pull back and other people act out in ways that are unproductive as well. We see one of those two things happening. And your chapter in there on the power of listening, I believe it's a superpower. And much like you say, it's definitely, we need to learn to listen to understand. There's a curiosity that we're not listening to try and have the right response, but we're listening to try and see it from the other person's perspective. And I would agree with you. I see too much now is that we listen to undermine and not listen to understand. Right?
That's a great way to put it. And as you said, I think in any group, people are going to be cautious about sharing their true feelings unless they're confident that it's safe. Think about the power of this. What if you had a company where everybody that worked there could say what they honestly thought? I gave a talk centered on this, Patrick. You'd love it. To a manufacturing company a couple years back, and I had a gentleman who worked there wait to talk to me afterwards. He said, I loved that vision, but I've got to tell you, the last time I said what I actually thought around here, I got sent home for a week. And it's funny, but it's not funny. People have learned that you can't say what you actually think in many cases. And what a waste, what an unproductive waste of human capacity and potential. The truth lives in all voices. I write about this a bit too. You think about, I picture, say, a faraway communist capital, a monolithic parade where everyone's marching in unison, chanting in unison. That's not alignment. That's intimidation and force and fear. That is not alignment. Alignment actually comes from the diversity of thought. That's where alignment comes from. When everybody feels like every idea is valued, that's how you create support for decisions and outcomes.
Yeah. And back to your story about that person that came up to you after and said that, basically I got sent home for a week. To me, I think about that and I speak to it now in the work that I do of saying that even if I wasn't the recipient of that, it set a ripple effect because other people saw what happened when I spoke up and they learned through that to say, I don't want to be like Jim. Jim's no longer here when he spoke up, so keep your mouth shut.
That's exactly what happened. So a really important point that we talked a lot about with our managers is the pivot point is how you respond when someone says something that you don't totally agree with. And what we've tried to do here at our company is get over the need to respond at all. So here's what I mean by that. So we're talking about a subject, and you, Patrick, make a comment in let's say, a huddle with a lot of employees. My general response is going to be this: Patrick, thanks so much for sharing that. That's it. I don't need to qualify what you said. I don't need to validate it. I don't need to denigrate it. I just need to honor that you were willing to say it. You already said it. And the fact that you said it makes it powerful. And once people start to see we're not searching, there is no right answer, people will start to speak with their authentic, true voice, which is, of course, the irony of my journey is I had to lose at the time a piece of my voice to end up on a mission of trying to honor everyone else's authentic voice.
So powerful. As we're coming toward the end here, there was a story that you told in here when you were in Kiev about how that whole thing transpired in terms of how you found out about that in the beginning. And I was shocked to hear the number of people that were involved in this in Ukraine. Never really had thought about it. It's Holodomor. And you talk about, there was an interview you have with a woman, Mikola. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, because I will tell you, as I read that, I welled up. As you think of the life that we're living now, about how difficult things are, and then you read this, and it just puts things in perspective in terms of, I think, our spirits, what we can handle and still move forward.
Glad you're asking me about this, Patrick. So one of the core theses in my book is that throughout human history, leaders, those who've had the most power, have often overreached and abused it. They've gone too far, which has consequences clearly for those who they overreach against, but it also ends up collapsing the empire. That leaders get greedy, they go too far. And I wanted to write about an example of this, and I came across the true historical story of the Holodomor in the Ukraine in the early 1930s. The Soviet Union had formed against all odds about a decade before. Stalin had replaced Lenin, had come to power. The Soviet Union was rolling out its first 5-year collective plan, and the Ukrainian peasants weren't really going along. They were used to their independence and running their own farms, and they had some of the most productive farmland in all of Europe. It was the breadbasket of Europe. Stalin and the Soviet Communist Party, in response to this recalcitrance, decided, as crazy as it is to say, as horrific, to respond by starving the Ukrainian peasants to death. So the communists went door to door, took all the food sources, goats, pigs, wheat, everything, and blockaded a large section of the Ukraine for about 24 months. And in the breadbasket of Europe, about 7 million Ukrainian citizens died of starvation, which is Holodomor translated means forced starvation. So I got it in my head, this is a lumberman from Casco, Maine, that I would go to Kiev in the Ukraine and interview a couple of the last living survivors of the Holodomor. I ended up connecting with the Holodomor Victims Memorial in Kiev, made plans to travel there. They took me out and we interviewed one gentleman, Mykola, one woman, Hannah, and I simply recorded their stories, honored their stories. They both were born in around 1925. So they were just old enough to have remembered the Holodomor and yet still be alive today. Both are in their 90s. And I have a big chapter at the end of the book about that story, with the sub-theme being overreaching has consequences. But what really gives me goosebumps in that story was giving these two individuals a global voice for their story to actually be heard. And just to tag on to the end of that, that's an example to me of where corporate leadership needs to head. The old model of corporate leadership was about staying in your lane, keep your head down, worry about your own product or service. And while, of course, we've got to be exceptional at that, the world needs something bigger and broader for corporate leadership today. And we actually need corporate leaders to get out of their lane, to think about their roles more broadly, and to engage bigger topics like, what if we led differently? And that's really what the book's about.
Again, that story to me is just so powerful. And I hope people have a chance to read that, because one of her lines basically was, "I'm still around." Right.
Yes. I was in Hannah's apartment. And it was surreal, Patrick. We're on like the 8th floor of a Soviet-era apartment complex. The elevator's got 8 million wires sticking out of it as we churn up. Spent 2 hours with her, and I asked her thoughts about Stalin, and she paused and she said, "Yeah, Stalin's dead and I'm still here." And she slapped her leg and had a big laugh.
So as we wrap things up, for those that are listening and in leadership roles that might be saying, you know what, I don't have the time right now to develop or to focus on developing leadership, or to work on my team or my organization to focus on the importance of leadership. What do you say to that?
I would say, I'm sure you can prove you're right. That anyone who wants to be too busy for that will easily be able to. And anyone who wants to find time to prioritize it will easily be able to.
There's nothing else I can say. Kevin, I have appreciated this so much. Again, I loved reading your book. The time that we've been able to spend together, I have a great deal of respect for you. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm always honored to be with you, Patrick, and I appreciate the way you give a louder voice to really important leadership ideas. So right back at you, my friend.
Great. Wishing you all the best in 2021.
Same to you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.